Amelie was the kind of woman most people didn't notice. Every morning, she arrived early at K-Tech Holdings, dressed in soft-colored Ankara skirts and neat blouses. Her smile was gentle, and her voice never rose above a whisper. She brought tea before anyone asked, solved problems before they became crises, and remembered things even the CEO forgot. To them, she was just the assistant, someone to take notes, fix calendars, and stay out of the way. But Amelie was watching everything, listening, learning. She stayed late after everyone had gone home, sometimes staring at the glass windows, imagining a world where she wasn't invisible. In those quiet hours, she read business plans, rewrote contracts, and even corrected numbers in the investor slides, while others took the credit. But she never complained. She never bragged. What they didn't know was that Amelie had her own vision, her own plan. Every paycheck she earned, she invested silently. Every insult she received, she turned into fuel. She wasn't just surviving K-Tech, she was studying it from the inside out. And while they looked right through her, Amelie was quietly building something far bigger than a job. She was building her moment, and it was coming soon. Mandla walked through the K-Tech office like he owned the world because in his mind he did. He wore custom-made suits, gold cufflinks, and a watch worth more than most people's salaries. People stood up when he entered. They laughed at his dry jokes. They feared his temper. And Mandla loved it. Power was his favorite drug. Every decision had to go through him. Every success was his alone. And anyone who dared to question him, fired without warning. To Mandla, Amelie was nothing more than a background character. Just a secretary. The girl who booked flights, sent emails, and kept quiet. He never noticed the extra work she did or the way she stayed behind fixing things after others had left. He certainly never thanked her. In meetings, he spoke over her. In front of others, he ignored her like she didn't exist. And when he did speak to her, it was only to give commands, cold, short, and without eye contact. She was useful, sure, but easily replaceable. That's what he believed. What Mandla didn't know was that every time he looked down on Amelie, he was giving her more reason to rise. He was so sure of himself, so blinded by pride, that he never imagined she could be a threat. He had no idea she was quietly learning the business better than he ever had. No idea she was building connections, studying deals, watching how he handled power, and how he abused it. Mandla thought he was untouchable. He thought he'd built a kingdom no one could shake. He thought loyalty meant silence and silence meant weakness. But he was wrong about everything. Especially about Amelie. And on the day he fired her, thinking he'd erased her from his story, he unknowingly wrote the first line of hers. The empire he believed would last forever was about to crumble, and it would start with the woman he never saw coming. At first Lyra tried to ignore it. She told herself she was just overthinking. But deep down, something didn't feel right anymore. Duma, who used to rush home just to eat dinner with her, suddenly started working late, almost every night. When she asked, he always had a reason. Deadlines, he'd say, or just one more client meeting. He stopped noticing the small things. Her new hairstyle, the perfume she wore just for him, the soft tears she quietly wiped when he turned away too fast. Lyra's heart began to ache, not from anything he said, but from the growing silence between them. And then there was Nomi. Her smile wasn't the same. It had a nervous twitch now, like it was hiding something. She started avoiding eye contact. She didn't stay over as much. She laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny and always changed the subject when Duma's name came up. Lyra saw it all, but she didn't want to believe it. She wanted to hold on to her peace, to the love she had poured her soul into. But love doesn't cover everything. It can't hide what your heart already knows. Sometimes when Lyra walked into a room, both Duma and Nomi would fall silent, as if they had just pressed pause on a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Her stomach would tighten, but she still smiled. She cooked for them. She sat beside them. She forced herself to believe that everything was fine. But late at night, when the house was quiet and only the ticking clock kept her company, her thoughts screamed. Her gut whispered the truth her mind wasn't ready for. Lyra didn't have proof, just 1,000 tiny cracks in her soul that kept spreading. It was the lipstick stain on a glass that wasn't hers. The scent of Nomi's lotion lingering in her home longer than it should. The way Duma's phone was suddenly always face down. Suspicion grew in silence. And sometimes silence speaks louder than words ever could. Emily heard every whisper, every little comment, every fake smile followed by an eye roll as soon as she turned around. She's just a secretary, they said. Why is she always in meetings? Some joked that she was trying too hard. Others claimed she was only close to the CEO because she made good coffee. The cruel ones even suggested she was only there because of how she looked. But Emily never reacted. She kept her head down, her focus sharp, and her heart steady. In meetings, when she tried to speak up with an idea or a correction, some senior staff would interrupt her mid-sentence. Others would nod politely but ignore her completely, as if her voice didn't matter. She wasn't part of their inner circle. She didn't wear designer suits or drive a fancy car. To them, she wasn't important enough to be taken seriously. And yet, Emily never stopped showing up. She sat in those rooms, took every note, watched every move, and remembered who smiled in her face and mocked her behind her back. She pretended not to hear, but it hurt. Of course it did. She was human. There were nights she cried quietly in her bedroom, wondering why kindness and hard work were never enough. But each time she wiped her tears, she reminded herself, they only whispered because they were afraid. Deep down, they could feel there was something different about her. She didn't gossip, she didn't compete, and she didn't play office politics. She moved with quiet power, and that made them uncomfortable. Emily knew her worth didn't depend on their opinions. She didn't need their validation to rise. Every insult, every laugh behind her back, was a small brick in the foundation she was building. A foundation that would one day lift her above all of them, not through revenge but through results. And when that day came, the same people who whispered behind her back would be the ones saying her name out loud with respect and maybe even regret. The sun hadn't fully risen when Emily arrived at the office that morning. She wore her favorite soft blue blouse and a calm smile, unaware that this day would change everything. The energy in the building was different, tense, rushed. It was the day of KTech's biggest investor meeting, and everyone was on edge. But Emily was prepared. She had stayed up half the night organizing the reports, printing documents, and making sure every single detail was perfect. Just as she settled at her desk, Manla's assistant walked over, barely meeting her eyes. The CEO wants to see you. Now. Emily stood up without hesitation, smoothed her skirt, and walked into his office with her usual quiet grace. Manla didn't even look up from his desk. He simply said in a cold, flat voice, "You're fired." No explanation. No thank you. No emotion. Just those two words that hit like a slap across the face. Emily stood still for a moment, stunned. "Is there a reason, sir?" she asked softly. Manla finally looked up, his face blank. "We don't owe you that," he said. "Security will walk you out." It was as if all those years of hard work, late nights, loyalty meant nothing. Not even a minute of respect. Her chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. No one would see her break. She nodded slowly, turned around, and walked out of the office as if nothing had happened. Her hands shook slightly as she packed her things into a small cardboard box. Her notebook, a plant, a photo of her mother. Whispers started again. People peeked from behind computer screens. No one helped. No one asked if she was okay. But Emily didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just smiled gently to herself, held her box tightly, and walked through the office one last time. They thought they had ended her story. What they didn't know was they had just set it on fire. In Ebitala, news didn't travel, it flew. And when Lyra disappeared without a word, the gossip started before the sun even rose. Neighbors whispered over fences. Market women shook their heads. "Did you hear? Lyra caught them in bed. She must be crushed. Poor thing, she ran away in shame." Some even said she had lost her mind, gone somewhere to cry herself to sleep every night. The stories got worse each day, and not once did anyone stop to ask what really happened. But Lyra heard none of it. She was far away from the noise, tucked into a quiet guest house near Lake Adani, surrounded by soft winds, singing birds, and her own thoughts. She didn't open social media. She didn't answer calls. For the first time in years, she was alone with herself, and it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. While the world thought she was broken, she was actually rebuilding. Day by day, piece by piece. She started journaling again, pouring her pain onto paper and turning it into power. She began walking every morning by the lake, breathing in freedom with every step. She enrolled in an online business course she had once postponed for marriage. She made tea with her favorite herbs and reminded herself that healing wasn't loud. It was quiet, slow, and sacred. Lyra looked at herself in the mirror one evening and finally saw it. Not the woman who had been betrayed, but the woman who had survived it. Stronger, wiser, softer but sharper. They thought she had run away. But she hadn't. She had chosen to step away from the noise, the pain, the people who didn't value her. She wasn't hiding. She was healing. She wasn't ashamed. She was awakening. And while they all waited to see her return with tears in her eyes, they had no idea. Lyra wasn't planning a comeback for their approval. She was preparing a return they would never forget. Later that same afternoon, Mandla walked into the glass boardroom like a man arriving to claim his crown. His steps were sharp, his suit perfectly tailored, and his smile full of pride. This was supposed to be his big day. The moment he'd finally announce KTech's international expansion to the investors, the board, and the media partners watching via livestream. Months of planning had led to this. He imagined applause, handshakes, maybe even headlines with his name. The boardroom buzzed with quiet excitement. Investors from across Africa and abroad were seated, flipping through the sleek presentation folders Amelie had prepared just days earlier. Cameras were being set up in the back. Mandla took his seat at the head of the long polished table, looking around with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today marks a new chapter for KTech." His voice echoed through the room, smooth and full of control. He motioned to the tech team. "Please start the presentation." The lights dimmed slightly. The projector blinked to life. But instead of the company logo or the expansion roadmap, something else appeared on the screen. Something Mandla didn't expect. His smile faltered. The first slide was titled New Leadership, New Vision. At the bottom in bold gold letters, Amelie Dubé Partner, 48% stakeholder. The room went still. Mandla stared at the screen, frozen. He glanced at the board members. Some looked confused. Others already knew. Murmurs spread. Questions started to rise. His chest tightened. He leaned forward trying to speak, but no words came out. Everything he had planned, every moment he had imagined, the applause, the praise, it all disappeared in seconds, because this meeting, the one meant to prove his power, had just been taken from him. Not by a rival, not by a competitor, but by the woman he had fired that very morning. And this was only the beginning. The projector flickered softly, and for a split second, Mandla thought there was a technical glitch. But then the image became clear, bold and impossible to ignore. In white letters against a deep navy background, the slide read, New Partner 48% Ownership. And just below it in gold, Amelie Dubé. At first, the room went completely silent. No one moved. No one even breathed. Mandla's jaw tightened. He blinked, thinking maybe he had misread it. But the name stayed right there, bright, powerful, undeniable. His chest tightened. A nervous laugh almost escaped his lips, but it died quickly. This wasn't a joke. Amelie's name, the assistant he had fired just hours earlier, was now front and center, introduced not as a staff member, but as a partner. With nearly half the company, Mandla gripped the edge of the table. His eyes darted toward the board members. A few stared back at him with unreadable expressions. One or two even looked satisfied. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a surprise slide. This had been planned. Quietly. Carefully. Without him. A few investors leaned in, whispering to each other. Someone at the far end of the table asked, "Is this correct?" The head of legal simply nodded, flipping through his notes. "Fully verified," he said. "She's been acquiring shares over the last 3 years through outside investment groups. All legal. All approved." Mandla felt the heat rise in his face. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. His voice didn't come. He had fired her that morning, thinking she was just an assistant, a name he could erase with one cold sentence. But now her name had returned, bigger, louder, and carrying more weight than his own. The room was still quiet, but the silence now had a different meaning. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was power shifting. And Mandla, once the king of the room, was no longer the one in control. The woman he had overlooked had just become the one they were all looking at. Just as the room buzzed with whispers and rising questions, the boardroom door opened, and Amelie walked in. Every head turned. She wore a striking Ankara power suit in deep burgundy and gold, with bold patterns that wrapped around her shoulders like armor. Her hair was wrapped in a matching gelly, tall and elegant. She didn't smile. She didn't rush. She simply walked, head high, shoulders back, each step steady and graceful, like a queen returning to her rightful throne. No one said a word, but the energy in the room shifted the moment she entered. The same people who used to look through her now couldn't take their eyes off her. She walked straight to the front, next to the projector screen that still showed her name. She didn't even glance at Mandla. He was just a shadow in the corner now. She stood tall, her hands calmly resting on the edge of the table. Her eyes met each board member's one by one, not with anger but with power. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was louder than anything she could say. "I believe you've all seen the slide," she said, her voice clear, calm, and full of quiet fire. "Let's begin." There was no shakiness in her tone. No bitterness. Just certainty. Mandla watched, stunned and silent, as his room now leaned toward her. Investors who never acknowledged her before now nodded with interest. Executives who once rolled their eyes now sat up straighter. The woman they called just the secretary had transformed before their eyes. Not suddenly, but with years of patience, planning, and purpose. Amelie didn't gloat. She didn't explain her rise. She didn't need to. Because the truth was clear. This moment wasn't luck or revenge. It was earned. Every second of silence. Every insult. Every long night had led her here. She had been underestimated her whole life. But now they were seeing her for the first time, and no one would forget what they saw. Lyra stepped up to the mic, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor beneath the altar. The guests were still whispering, confused by the absence of a groom. Some had leaned forward, waiting for someone to join her. Others thought maybe the groom would walk in late as a surprise. But when Lyra took the mic and turned to face the crowd, everyone went silent. She smiled gently, her eyes glowing, not with anger but peace. Calm, steady, graceful. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear and soft. "I know many of you came here today expecting to see me marry someone. A man. Partner. A love story. But today I've chosen something different." People leaned in closer. "Today," she said, pausing for a moment as she looked directly at Duma and Nomi sitting near the front, "I marry the woman who loved me the most, me." The crowd gasped. Chairs shifted. Mouths opened. Hands covered lips. Duma's face went pale. Nomi's eyes widened, her jaw trembling. They had expected drama, maybe even revenge. But they hadn't expected this kind of power. This kind of grace. This kind of freedom. Lyra stood tall, her smile never fading. "For years I gave everything I had, my love, my time, my loyalty. I forgot how to love myself. I let others eat from my plate while I went hungry. But not anymore." Her voice didn't shake. "This is my day. My new beginning. Not to prove anything to the people who betrayed me, but to honor the woman who survived it." Tears welled up in a few guests' eyes. A few women nodded slowly, moved beyond words. This wasn't just a statement, it was a revolution. Lyra gently placed the mic down, picked up a simple ring from the velvet box beside her, and slid it onto her own finger. A symbol. Promise. To never forget her worth again. And just like that, she turned heartbreak into history. This wasn't a wedding of two. It was the crowning of one. And she wore that crown with no shame, only power. Lyra stood at the altar, holding a small card in her hand. But these weren't traditional vows. There was no groom waiting to hold her hand, no promises of for better or worse to another person. These vows were different, deeper. They were for her. For the woman who had been torn, bruised, abandoned, and still rose. The music stopped. All eyes were on her. The garden was silent, as if the world was holding its breath. She looked out at the crowd and then back at herself in the small mirror placed on the table beside her. Slowly she began to speak. "For so long I thought love meant sacrificing myself. I thought being a good wife meant ignoring the voice inside me when it cried for help. I thought loyalty meant staying silent, even when it hurt," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But today I make new promises. To me." She took a deep breath. "I vow to never shrink myself to make others feel bigger. I vow to listen when my heart whispers, not just when it screams. I promise to protect my peace, even if it means walking alone. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I promised to forgive myself, for ignoring red flags, for trusting people who didn't deserve me, for staying too long. I promised to speak kindly to myself, to believe in myself, to fight for my dreams again. She placed her hand gently over her chest. And most importantly, I promised to never betray myself again. There wasn't a single dry eye in the crowd. Even those who came out of curiosity now sat in awe. These weren't just words, they were a healing, a cleansing, a declaration of worth. Duma sat frozen, guilt heavy on his face. Nomi looked down, unable to meet Lyra's eyes. But Lyra didn't look their way. Her focus was on something bigger, her future. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a sacred moment. A woman choosing herself, fully, publicly, proudly. As the ceremony ended and the sun began to set over Muneo Gardens, waiters in crisp white uniforms began handing out small cream-colored gift boxes to every guest. Each box was tied with a delicate indigo ribbon, the same shade as Lyra's gown. People smiled, thinking they were about to receive a fancy thank you gift. Maybe chocolates, scented candles, or souvenir jewelry. But when the boxes were opened, the garden fell into an eerie silence. Inside each box were photographs. Clear, undeniable, painful photographs of Duma and Nomi. In hotel lobbies, in the back seat of his car, holding hands behind closed doors, kissing in dimly lit corners, laughing on nights they told Lyra they were just running errands or busy with work. Proof. Receipts. Every single photo dated and time-stamped. And tucked neatly beneath the photos was a handwritten note from Lyra. Just one sentence. This was never about revenge. It was about release. Guests sat stunned. Some gasped. Others looked around, unsure of what to say or do. Whispers swept through the garden like a sudden windstorm. She knew all along. She had the receipts. She planned all this with so much grace. No shouting. No drama. Just truth served cold and quiet. Duma stared at the photos in disbelief, his hands shaking. Nomi's face turned white, then red, then pale again. The shame hit harder than any insult ever could. Because Lyra hadn't exposed them out of spite. She had done it with elegance. With peace. With power. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about setting herself free. Every person who opened that box didn't just witness the betrayal. They felt the weight of what Lyra had carried in silence. The pain. The dignity. The decision to walk away without a single scream, only strength. It was the kind of truth that didn't scream, it echoed. And in that moment everyone finally understood. Lyra didn't just walk away. She let go. By the next morning Lyra's story was everywhere. Videos from the ceremony flooded social media. Clips of her walking alone down the aisle in that royal indigo gown. Her vows to herself. And the moment guests opened those small boxes with the photos inside. People reposted, shared, and commented faster than a wildfire. Hashtags like #LyraTheQueen, #SelfLoveWedding, and #RebirthBride trended for days. Women across Ebitala and even far beyond felt something shift. They saw themselves in Lyra's pain and felt hope in her courage. She was no longer just the woman who was cheated on. She was something bigger, something powerful. A symbol of healing, of standing tall after being crushed, of rewriting your own story on your own terms. Interviews started pouring in. Journalists called her brave. Therapists quoted her words about never betraying yourself again. Influencers used her story to inspire their followers, calling her a new kind of queen, one who didn't need a king. And Lyra? She watched it all quietly from the guest house near Lake Adani, her heart still fragile but beating stronger each day. She had never planned to go viral. She only wanted to free herself. But now thousands of women were thanking her, writing messages about how they too would choose themselves from this day forward. Even older aunties who once gossiped about her now called to say, "We are proud of you, child." Lyra felt the weight lift off her shoulders, a little more with every kind word. She was no longer alone. She had started a movement without meaning to, one that told every woman, your worth is not tied to who stays or who leaves. Your worth is tied to you. Lyra smiled softly as she read the messages flooding her phone. Her journey had begun in heartbreak, but it was ending in power. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading, rising, and the world had no choice but to watch her shine. Lyra didn't just heal, she transformed. What started as a personal act of courage became the beginning of a whole new life. After her story went viral, brands started reaching out. Clothing labels wanted her to model confidence. Book publishers offered her deals to write her story. Mental health organizations asked her to speak to young women. Suddenly, the same voice that had once been quiet in her own marriage was now echoing across stages and screens. She accepted every opportunity, but on her terms. No filters. No pretending. She spoke from the heart, sharing her pain, her strength, and how she found herself again after being betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Her honesty hit deep. Women cried at her talks. Young girls lined up for photos. Aunties thanked her for saying things they were never allowed to say. She launched her own foundation, the Rebirth Project, which supported women going through emotional betrayal, divorce, and identity loss. She created workshops, safe spaces, and programs that helped women rebuild, not just survive. Slowly, Lyra became more than a story. She became a movement. Her days were now full of color. Early morning interviews, powerful stage talks, late-night journal entries by the lake. She wore bold colors again. She danced without fear. She laughed without guilt. And most of all, she loved herself without apology. Duma and Nomi became nothing more than names from her past. People still whispered about them, but Lyra never mentioned them again. She had no need. She had already said everything that needed to be said. With her silence, her strength, and her success. This was her empire now, built not on revenge but on rebirth. Lyra didn't need to shout to prove anything. She simply lived, fully, loudly, beautifully. And this time she made one thing clear. No more shrinking. No more begging. No more apologies. Only power. Only peace. Lyra now lives in a quiet, sun-kissed home near Lake Awoja, surrounded by still waters and soft winds. Every morning she wakes up to the sound of birds, not the weight of betrayal. She makes her tea slowly, walks barefoot in the garden, and watches the sunrise like it's her personal miracle. There's no chaos, no pretending, no walking on eggshells. Just peace. Real quiet peace. She no longer checks her phone with fear. She doesn't cry into her pillow or ask herself why she wasn't enough. That version of Lyra, the one who begged for love, who gave everything without being seen, is gone. In her place stands a woman who knows exactly who she is. The betrayal that once shattered her didn't break her forever. It woke her up. It reminded her of her worth. And instead of staying in that pain, she turned it into something powerful. She became her own home, her own healer, her own queen. People still talk about her, but not with pity anymore. Now they speak with awe. She's the woman who married herself. She turned heartbreak into a whole movement. She walked alone and still won. Lyra doesn't need a crown to feel royal. Her peace is her crown now. And every time she looks at the lake's calm reflection, she sees it clearly. A woman who was broken but never destroyed. A queen who walked alone and never looked back.